contradictions in terms of what they've got.
So these guys are part of the. I don't think I.
But I think the industrial revolution provides a bit of a goal. It did, yeah. I think from our sides, we're obviously a very we welcome both sorts of we are
How long has it been?
kind of the foundational sector, the opportunity that provides particularly for young people to get that sort of thing like that. Such an important tool for young people trying to make their way.
You guys publish some new stuff?
I mean, I still think they're still I was never that fussed. It was big and it needed to be. I'll give you a wave. And externally, I think my trustees ended up, like, silly Billy talking to you. I think it was just the shift of it. Like,
I was recognising, but I hadn't been for the badge. I'd be like, good. Still, literally.
Sorry. I know I had it all in my phone.
So she's changed it.
Oh no,
So it means that you can move that.
You just get dizzy. And I think he's going to put that with the sign.
He's tried an athletic stuff really I'm just writing it up. Like when he did a thing at school where they did running, actually, he got an hour. He just he'd never run.
I think in these times,
Like he did.
I'm from a fairly stage you are, but like we'd seen it.
He's been doing
Oh, hello, I'm Heather.
You just spot the patterns, right? It's like you spot the patterns when you're talking, like when you're like, we were just talking about that.
Yeah, you should remember. Misbehaving.
Just go, oh my god, what I need to do. And then you give them food, and it's a different child. Like, if you have two of them, you're really screwed. Also, like, sometimes if they're tired, it's just hard.
No, in fact, we've never used this venue before. We actually ourselves
Did you know?
so we sort of find.
I think partly on like the mission document.
Ah, okay. I hadn't realised.
Like the management.
No, so what we do is
Sending the right message.
Yeah, you have to fix it.
I'm going to look at it again through that lens.
we don't really deliver. And if a little bit like yours, organisation like it.
No recognition. Hi Tara, how are you?
Trying to get another one.
It's a really good point. Hadn't been to the
Just stick one, yeah.
Not to have your name at the front. There's a lot about the finance people you need to know.
Doing something that's really well aligned.
This side of it.
Yeah, I think everyone's going to get a load of stuff done.
And I don't need to turn it.
Well, I've switched it on for you, so you're all good.
Sorry, the camera and the sound not on.
Very good to see you. You're doing a report. I know. Exciting. I mean, do you know what I'm supposed to do? Right, let's go for it. Just take my glasses.
lives and well-being. I think after the 24 hours we've had, I think we can say that economic policy making isn't good for the personal well-being of the people doing the economic policy making. Hopefully we can take a broader view this morning and think about how to integrate quality of life and happiness and well-being into policy making in a more sort of coherent way. We hear a lot about growth, don't we? We don't hear quite so much about the impact of that on people's personal lives and personal experiences. So before we begin, a few practical notes. There are refreshments outside, and we'll have a break at 10:40, and we'll have some time for audience questions later in the session, so have a think. And I think if you're online, if you're watching online, you can also ask questions, so have a think about those, and they're going to magically appear on this really quite small phone next to me, so I've got my glasses, so that's all, that's all good to get ready to type your question up if you're at home. And if you're sharing your thoughts on social media, please tag PBE directly on LinkedIn or Blue Sky, or use the hashtag PBE events. Okay, so let's start with John. John Franklin is the Chief Economist at Pro Bono Economics and has produced this really interesting report using ONS data and analysis of it on well-being in the UK over recent years. So, John, come join us.
Thank you very much, Heather, and thank you all for coming along. I should probably start by saying it very much wasn't just me that produced this report. There's a number of colleagues, particularly including Marie and Beth, that had a lot to do with it. I can't see them, you can give us a wave if you're in the room somewhere. There we go, at the back, hiding. But they share responsibility. Now, without wanting to get too existential at this time on a sunny Thursday morning, I'm going to start with quite a big question, which is what makes for a decent life? That's fundamentally what we're talking about today. Now, if we asked everyone in the room, we get hundreds of different perspectives on that. There'll probably be some common themes, probably around our health, the health of our loved ones, connection to where we live and people around us, having good quality work to do that pays enough for us to be able to participate in society. But the problem is, all of us would weigh those different things slightly differently. All of us would put value on each of these things in a different way. And that leads us to the question, how do we understand, how would the Office of National Statistics ever understand what makes for a decent life? What doesn't? Who hasn't got a decent life at the moment? Who's thriving and who's really struggling? And the solution to that is never going to be in deciding on what sort of objective criteria you do, because we never all agree on that. But what we can do is ask people how their life is going. And that's exactly what the Office of National Statistics has been doing since 2011, when it came out with its standardised personal wellbeing questions. And been able to track how the nation is doing using those. So how do they do that? What are the questions that they ask? Now, I appreciate lots of you will already know this, so I'm going to do a very quick look through, just so we all understand the key measures of personal wellbeing that the Office of National Statistics uses. So there's 4 of them. They're up on the screen. Imaginatively, for a group of statisticians, they are called the ONS 4. They are, overall, how satisfied are you with your life nowadays? Overall, to what extent do you feel the things you do in your life are worthwhile? Overall, how happy did you feel yesterday? And overall, how anxious did you feel yesterday? And across those 4 questions, they pretty much cover the kind of key, I guess, philosophical drivers of well-being that have been talked about ever since ancient Greek times. Now, it also turns out that as a set of sort of deceptively simple questions, they do a pretty good job of capturing what matters in people's lives. They respond in sensible ways to the kinds of things that we would expect to impact on people's lives, and there's a lot of research to demonstrate that. Now, for our purposes, for the report that we published yesterday, I was caught in a trap, No Wellbeing in the UK in 2025, we focus on one of these in particular, and that's the one at the top left, the question, life satisfaction question, overall, how satisfied are you with your life nowadays? It's scored on a 0 to 10 scale, where 0 is completely dissatisfied and 10 is completely satisfied, and we are particularly focused on the low end of that, because we think those are the people that are really struggling in society, the people that are going to need support both from the social sector, but also government, but also the private sector, to help them to improve their quality of life and start to thrive again. So we focus on the group that the ONS describes as having low well-being. They score 0 to 4 on this 10 scale, and we describe those as people living in poverty, in well-being poverty. Now, why do we focus on life satisfaction? Well, it tends to be more stable over time. than some of the other measures. So we know that it doesn't fluctuate as much based on day-to-day mood and feelings and bad experiences that you had yesterday. It tends to be far more step back and reflective, so it tends to be more stable and reflect what's going on overall in people's lives. It's very well researched, so it's one of the leading measures used in most of the research around wellbeing in the UK. So we know that it sort of behaves itself, so it responds in pretty sensible ways, and it does a good job of capturing what matters to people. But also it sits at the heart of Treasury guidance released in 2021 around using wellbeing for understanding the impact and choosing and developing policies within government. So it seems like a pretty good, stable, decent measure for understanding the overall quality of life in the UK. It's not perfect, no single measure ever is, but it does a good job, and that's well evidenced now. So what's been happening to wellbeing poverty over time? The number of people who are scoring 0 to 4 on that scale for the life satisfaction question. Well, for the first full year of data that we have from the INS, there's around 3 million people in the UK living in wellbeing poverty. That was back in 2012. We saw significant improvements in that over most of the first decade until we reached the pandemic, which was in 2020. And unsurprisingly at that point, we saw a big jump up in the number of people living in wellbeing poverty as quality of life dropped down quite dramatically. What is potentially a bit more surprising is that we haven't really had a recovery since that point. We are still at an elevated level of wellbeing poverty compared to where we were prior to the pandemic. And we've got around 2.9 million people living in the UK today, 2.9 million adults, actually we haven't covered children in this, but 2.9 million adults living in wellbeing poverty today. And that's around 500,000 more than we had prior to the pandemic in 2019. Now, why is that? I think we can all understand why levels of life satisfaction dropped in 2020 as the pandemic hit. There was a lot of uncertainty, a lot of concern, lockdowns. None of it was fun, particularly any of you that had to deal with homeschooling like I did. Then I'm sure we all appreciate that our life satisfaction dropped quite substantially during that time. But why has it got stuck? Why haven't we seen it recover, given that we are now 5 years later after the pandemic? Our analysis in the report suggests that we can explain almost all of this rise that we saw since 2019 based on 3 key drivers of well-being. Our general health, so the important part, our physical health, our mental health, and feelings of loneliness. On this slide, we try and break down that jump from levels of wellbeing poverty in 2019, so there's around 2.5 million people at that point living in wellbeing poverty, to the levels in 2022. And we have to use 2022 because the data that has all of this information on people's mental health well-being, unfortunately, only takes as far as 2022 in terms of overall data for the UK. But we can see that general health, mental health, and loneliness are the 3 biggest contributors to this. There are some other factors, so the fact that population grew over this period, and there are some other unexplained factors that capture some of this difference. But between those 3 key factors, that accounts for more than 400,000 of that 500,000 increase in wellbeing poverty that we've seen over that period. Now, of itself, I guess that isn't surprising. In 2020, I think we probably all knew that our mental health, fears around our health and loneliness were challenges as we went through that pandemic period. But I think what's more concerning is that this is part of a much longer term trend. Whilst the pandemic exacerbated these trends, actually they've been going on for a far longer period. So this shows data going back to 2011 for the proportion of adults struggling with their mental health, the proportion of adults that often feel lonely in yellow, and the proportion of adults that rate their general health as poor in black at the bottom. And we're seeing long-term sustained increases. And yes, there was a jump up around the pandemic, but this is part of a longer-term pattern. It looks like quite a sustained structural pattern in the UK. And that's concerning because it means that that increase that we've seen, that elevation in the level of wellbeing poverty that we saw following the pandemic, the reason that hasn't gone away is because it's driven by long-term trends, and they haven't gone away. And trends that go on for that long are typically quite hard to turn around. And that's concerning not just now, but also for the future, because we tend to find there's quite a strong interaction between these 3 key drivers of well-being, in that people who are struggling with their health are more likely to struggle with their mental health, are more likely to feel lonely. People that feel lonely are more likely to struggle with their mental health and their physical health as well. And people that are struggling with their mental health are more likely to feel lonely and more likely to be struggling with their physical health as well. So there's really strong interactions, and that means that when we've got those 3 upward trends in all of these key factors, they're likely to be reinforcing each other. And that leads us to be pretty concerned that actually we're potentially stuck in a bit of a wellbeing poverty trap here in the UK. That the reason that has increased since before the pandemic is part of this long-term trend in these factors, and they're going to continue to reinforce each other and drive up that trend over time. And we've used our understanding of these relationships and our understanding of how they interact with measures of the economy, as well as with wellbeing levels as well, to look at, well, what could this mean for the levels of wellbeing in the future in the UK? What's it likely to mean for levels of wellbeing poverty? And our analysis suggests that without further action, we could see further deterioration in that trend in wellbeing poverty. So it could increase by around another 300,000 adults between now and 2030. So that's rising from around 2.9 million today, 2024, to 3.2 million in 2030. Now, if we use the Treasury's own methodology for thinking about how we value the changes in well-being, then that implies that the cost to the UK society of well-being poverty could increase to as much as £110 billion per year by 2030. And that's around £9 billion more than it is today. So that just gives you a sense. It's always hard to kind of get a sense of how important and how big this is. If you use the Treasury's own methodology, we're talking about hundreds of billions of pounds worth as a cost to society from this kind of wellbeing poverty. So it's material, it matters. Now, one of the key things on looking at this trend is that this is without further action. So this assumes policies that are in place today. Now, we have just had a spending review. I don't know if any of you noticed. Might have been a bit of coverage in the newspapers. But as part of that, one of the big decisions was to invest more money into health and social care. It's one of the major government decisions that's been made. And given that we talked about, well, mental health, physical health are such key drivers of well-being, we'd expect that to have an impact on levels of well-being poverty going forwards. Now, it's really hard to pinpoint exactly what the scale of that impact will be, but we've had a go. And I kind of put this forward as a tentative thought experiment of, well, what impact could those spending review decisions have on levels of well-being poverty? And our analysis suggests that it could be substantial. It could shift things from that upward trend out to 2030 to probably holding things around the level we've got today. So it's pushing back against that wellbeing headwind that we're faced, given those kind of key trends in health and loneliness, and leaving us at roughly the same point that we're starting at today by 2030. And that's obviously good. That's much better than having rising levels of wellbeing poverty, much better than having hundreds of thousands of additional people struggling with their lives. But is that an outcome that we're happy with as a society? A decade of wellbeing stagnation, as it would be by 2030, is that something that we'd be prepared to accept? As an organisation, PBE doesn't think we should accept that. We think that we should be looking to do more to try and tackle these trends and drive it back down towards the kinds of levels that we saw before the pandemic back in 2019. Now, how are we going to do that? Well, it's going to be partly about government spending and what it gets spent on. And the mixture of spending within health is also going to make a huge difference. We've highlighted that mental health is very important. We know that the new NHS strategy puts a lot of emphasis on mental health. That shift in spending probably is critical to tackling some of this. But it's going to take more than that. It's going to take a whole host of different policies to tackle these trends and turn them around. The good thing is that wellbeing is not only great for kind of tracking overall picture in the UK around quality of life, it's also really valuable for giving us a fresh lens for looking at potentially age-old problems that we've had in the UK. And the final chapter in our report looks at the housing sector and in particular the rental sector. Now, I don't have time this morning to go through it all in lots and lots of detail, but I'm going to do a very quick whip through and we'll do a follow-up session at another point where we'll dive into the housing-related material in a lot more detail. But just very quickly, if we look at the housing sector, and in particular the rental sector from a wellbeing perspective, what does it tell us? Well, the first thing is renters are struggling with their wellbeing. So renters are 3 times more likely to be living in wellbeing poverty than owner-occupiers. What's really interesting about this is that the causes for that, the drivers of that, are quite different depending on the type of renter. So for social renters, this is primarily down to health inequalities, which is, I guess, sort of what we'd expect given who tends to have access to social housing. But if you take into account the differences in health, in mental health, in loneliness, then actually the gap for social renters more or less disappears. So we know that for social renters, if we want to tackle this gap in well-being, then what we really need to tackle is health inequalities. And that takes us back to the previous discussion around the spending review and the strategy around the NHS and more broadly. But for private renters, it's a lot more than that. So whilst there are some differences in some of those health inequalities for private renters, they're a lot smaller, and it certainly doesn't account for the entire gap that we see in well-being for those people. And in fact, there remains a sort of private renters well-being penalty worth around £3,700 per year, again using that Treasury methodology, which can't be explained by the kind of standard drivers of well-being that tend to be used for this sort of analysis. So there's something else driving well-being down for private renters. What is that? Well, we start to take a first look at that in the final chapter of the report and try to think about what is it about private renting that is likely to cause these problems. And there's two factors that sort of jump out at us around it. The first one is the stability of private renting. We know that private renters expect to have to move far more frequently than owner-occupiers, and when people have to move around a lot, that causes a lot of disruption. It can disrupt social connections, it can disrupt what schools children are going to, it can disrupt whether you can still get to the job that you used to have. So it causes a lot of disruption, as well as just the pure stress of moving house that I'm sure we've all experienced. So that is definitely part of the story, and that seems to impact on that wellbeing penalty that private renters experience. The good news is that the government has got the Renters' Rights Bill going through Parliament at the moment, and that is pretty much primarily focused on that stability, giving more certainty, more control to renters so that they can have a more stable position in their housing. And that could potentially deliver quite substantial benefits. So if we could close that gap against owner-occupiers on the stability of housing, then that could potentially deliver improvements worth around £9 billion per year, again, using the Treasury methodology. Now that's substantial. And what gives us confidence that whilst we might not close that gap entirely, we probably can make a big dent in it with this kind of legislation, is that similar legislation was introduced in Scotland back in 2017. And since then, we've seen that wellbeing penalty for private renters north of the border close almost entirely over that period. So that gives us some confidence that actually these sorts of measures can make a difference, and they could start to close that wellbeing penalty experienced by private renters. However, when we look at what are the kind of drivers of this penalty in the UK, the one that really jumped at us is affordability. And unfortunately, the Renters' Rights Bill does very little in terms of affordability. It's very good in terms of improving the stability and increasing the rights for renters so that they are less likely to be forced to move as regularly. It doesn't do a lot on affordability. And actually, that difference in the proportion of people that say they can afford their rent or their housing costs for private renters compared to owner-occupiers explains a lot of that wellbeing penalty that we've talked about already for private renters. So without tackling that affordability issue, it's unlikely that we'll be able to close that gap. And at the moment, that gap in affordability is likely to be increasing the number of people living in wellbeing poverty by around 110,000. So a substantial chunk of that 2.9 million people that we've currently got living in wellbeing poverty. Now that is a very quick bit through what is a lot of work, and apologies, Beth, that I can't cover more of it. But we will be doing more sessions on this, so keep your eyes open for further information coming around that. But what I do think we can take away from the kind of broader picture is that it's not just about spending in terms of tackling this wellbeing inequality within the UK. It can also be about legislative changes that shift rights and responsibilities across different people in order to support those people that are struggling most with low wellbeing. And the Renters' Rights Bill is a good example that could help shift tens of thousands of people out of wellbeing poverty by shifting the responsibilities and rights from people that typically have higher well-being to people that typically have lower well-being, with minimal cost to government, although it does need to be enforced, which is an important issue. So that was a very quick canter through our report, just to kind of bring it all together then at the end. I guess one of the key things that we need to start off with is that genuinely the data on well-being is really good in the UK. We have a really strong understanding, and I think at this point we're pretty confident that it's robust and reliable to use to help us design policies and shape our society within the UK. Importantly, it suggests that wellbeing poverty, so the number of people living with very low levels of wellbeing, with poor quality of life, is still elevated compared to where we were prior to the pandemic, which feels pretty intuitive. It makes sense. But importantly, we don't think that that's going to bounce back on its own. We think it's going to require concerted effort to tackle those long-term entrenched trends around mental health, around physical health, around loneliness, to try and reverse this trend. And that's going to require a whole host of different solutions. What we would love to see is for the government to send a very clear message about prioritising the well-being of the people of the UK. We think that the data is absolutely good enough and better than lots of other options in terms of setting a headline target for the government to aim to reduce the levels of wellbeing poverty over time and set out really realistic goals for how they can achieve that over the next 4 years until the end of Parliament. So I'm going to stop there. There's lots more in the report. I encourage you to go and read it. It makes excellent reading in the bath, bedtime, wherever you are. But we've now got a chance to talk about it, haven't we?
Yeah, absolutely. Join us and we'll discuss that a bit further. Oh, giant pictures of us, just so you can see us double. A bit visual. Very true, very true. So we've got a great panel to discuss, to sort of probe a little bit further into some of those findings and what they might mean if we really did try and incorporate them into policy making. So we've got Safina Ahmad, who's the director of the John Ellerman Foundation. We have Charlie Courtney, economic policy manager at the CBI. We have Jo Switson, director of Partners for a New Economy, brackets and former leader of the Liberal Democrats. And John, of course, who we've heard from already. So maybe I could just start with three non-John panellists and ask you what your sort of takeaways, what your thoughts were about this finding. Sophia, should we start with you?
Yeah, happy to kick off. Thank you for the invite to be here. Really pleased to be able to join you all. I guess in some ways I was really struck in the report by the kind of clarity with which the information was presented. You know, we've got three key kind of factors to consider: loneliness, physical and mental health, and this kind of overarching reflection of what makes for a decent life. In many ways, I wish this report had been available while I was developing John Ellerman Foundation's current strategy, which we just launched about a month ago, because suffice to say, we didn't end up with quite such a well thought through three big things to think about in terms of wellbeing. For those of you that don't know us, John Ellerman Foundation has been around for just over 50 years, and our aim is to advance wellbeing for people, society and the natural world. And over the last 2 or 3 years in particular, we've been thinking really deeply about what wellbeing means. And I think as charities, we often talk about the role we play in terms of service to people, service to society, service to the natural world. But actually, in many ways, charity is about justice. And for us, we contemplated really deeply whether or not wellbeing still seemed to be the right lens through which to conduct our work. Especially because I think it is a term that has become quite co-opted. You get things like wellbeing influencers now who are really peddling ill-being, and you know, all of these ways in which it can feel a bit like a meaningless term, and that's why I'm really grateful to Pro Bono Economics and others who still recognise the importance of us all striving for wellbeing. And what we kind of concluded, not as thoughtfully, unfortunately, as the research that we've heard about today, is that if we are to achieve a decent life, and I like that framing, then actually we do need to think about wellbeing in terms of people, society and the natural world, and the three are very much interconnected but also interdependent, because if the natural world isn't well, then we as people won't be either, and so on and so forth. So a bit like the triangle earlier, but we've just used people, society and the natural world. And how we boiled it down, which I think comes through in this research as well, is that all of us have a right to a good life, and I think actually wellbeing is a concept that is very much rights-based as well, and I think that's something that comes through in the report, and it was a key takeaway for me reading it earlier this week. But if we are striving for a good life, then it is about basic needs, agency, equity. These are foundational needs. We cannot be us without them. And then if we are to become a flourishing society, which I think your report touches on, in that if we have access to housing that's affordable and decent and so on and so forth, then we do need that kind of focus on social equity, a deep democracy, ecological sustainability, and good economies, basically. And I think underlying all of the research, and I'm sure it'll be in our discussion, we'll be talking about these types of things a lot. And then our third kind of element for us about wellbeing is around this idea of a thriving planet. And what does that mean? How do we get from surviving, coping, adapting, and then ultimately thriving as a planet? And so a lot of that will be about protection, but also it's about restoration now, and it's mitigation, it's adaptation. It's like, how do we get to a place where we move to sustainable use and live within our planetary boundaries? And so I guess those were the kind of key takeaways for me, but I think there is something really important in this research and in our kind of framing of wellbeing about its interdependence. Like, my wellbeing is pointless if we don't all have that wellbeing. And so I think this kind of desire to achieve wellbeing at a people, society and natural world level is something that those of us who are in the charity sector hopefully will all be committed to.
Thank you very much. Charlie, if I come to you, I wonder what your thoughts are, and I suppose given your CBI hat, I wonder what the role of business and of employers is in these.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, I think from my perspective, probably sort of three key takeaways. I think sort of John touched upon it, but if you look at kind of the current government spending plans, whilst there is an opportunity to kind of maintain or sort of stop the decline in terms of wellbeing, we ultimately want to see a shift. And looking at kind of current spending plans, it's unlikely that we will see that kind of positive shift in terms of addressing wellbeing and poverty. So, from our perspective, not just government, but there needs to be quite a prominent business role there in terms of supporting wellbeing. But I also think we have to kind of take into account the sort of macroeconomic environment. So again, the report did touch upon kind of some assumptions around sort of employment and growth over the coming years. I think fundamentally we need to be kind of realistic that we are in a challenging macroeconomic environment. And I think over the kind of short term, we've recently sort of published our latest economic forecast. So looking to the rest of 2025 and indeed to 2026. And again, there are some challenges there in terms of a cooling labour market, an expectation that unemployment will tick up to 4.8%. And the point about kind of affordability, whilst we have kind of seen a rise in real wage growth over the previous months, we are expecting that to cool. So there is a point there in terms of the sort of macroeconomic environment not necessarily performing as strongly as we would want to try and fully shift the dial on wellbeing poverty. And then I think kind of my final sort of takeaway was the point that it is kind of young people who are particularly impacted by this kind of wellbeing poverty. And I think obviously for these young people trying to kind of get their foot on the career ladder, there are sort of broader policies, whether that be the rise in employer NICs or the kind of employment rights bill that is coming down the line. It is kind of making it more challenging for businesses to hire young people and provide those entry-level roles. So whilst as an organisation we share the ambition around the employment rights bill to provide kind of secure, good jobs for everyone, I think there are some questions around the sort of practical implementation of that and what that might mean for kind of hiring intention for firms, particularly looking at sort of the graduate market and young people trying to kind of get their first foot on the career ladder. So yeah, those are probably my main takeaways.
Thank you, Jo.
Well, the first thing is I feel really excited. So back in 2011, I remember when the ONS4 were kind of invented or born. And a couple of years before that, Richard Layard and I had set up the Old Party Parliamentary Group on Wellbeing Economics.
And we had a sort of small band of people from the House of Commons and the House of Lords that were interested in this, but it was fairly small. And then when the ONS questions were being put forward, very much encouraged by Gus O'Donnell, who was of course head of the civil service, but also actually championed David Cameron, which was, perhaps a surprising advocate, and I think he does deserve credit, because I remember at the launch of it, and I remember what the Daily Mail was kind of saying about it and the questions that he was fielding, because this was the kind of agenda that I was like, why are you bothering about, oh goodness, how frivolous, caring about people's well-being and happiness, as if that isn't something that we all care about. But that was the context, and there is still some of that, but I think it is less than what it was, probably partly because of the worsening situation makes it harder to make that point. But so it's really exciting to see this sort of coming into the potential, because what it was aimed to do was, you can't make decisions if you don't have information. How can a government assess one policy or another policy? And I think the example that you gave of what happened in Scotland to private renters after the legislation change is exactly what the potential of having that amazing data set from the ONS was. So first of all, it's just really exciting. Secondly, I think it gives us a glimpse of the future, because this is the kind of conversation that shouldn't only be happening in interesting events being held with 100 people or so in Victoria. This is the kind of conversation that should be happening in Parliament, right? As well as having big fiscal events like the budget or the comprehensive spending review, are we going to have a comprehensive wellbeing review? Are we going to have ministers standing up and saying, this is what we think with the current trends is going to happen to low well-being and people in well-being poverty, and this is what we're doing to address it, and how our plans are hoping to tackle these problems, and then actually create some accountability on these issues of well-being, which admittedly is harder than on, it's not even easy on some of the existing economic indicators like growth. There's been I don't know how many different growth plans which haven't delivered economic growth. But with well-being, it's so multifactorial that it's perhaps even more complicated. But nonetheless, it's what matters. So we need to just find a way of doing that. And I think that's where analysis like this report is the type of discussion that we need to be having. And then the final point I would just make is, I was really struck by what you said about, is that decade of well-being stagnation by 2030, is that something we're prepared to accept? And in a sense, the answer from this room is slightly academic, because I think we can see that is not something that the country is actually prepared to accept. And they might not be expressing it in a well-argued report, but they are expressing it, and people are not happy that life is too hard, that things aren't working. So then I think the really interesting set of questions for politics is, okay, so what is really driving that poor health, that poor mental health, that loneliness? And that is complex, and it is systemic, and it does take into account things that we've been doing within the natural world for decades, and what impact is plastics and clean air or lack of it, and what we're doing with water in our country, what impact is that having on our collective physical health and mental health, and also the fabric of society and communities, and the way in which we are valuing what can be measured by pounds, but not necessarily what matters in community. That's a really interesting discussion to get into. I fear politics will stick to the kind of safe topics of what has always worked in the past, but I think that decade of wellbeing stagnation is not going to be acceptable, and that's why this is urgent for politics to get engaged in.
Interesting. And John, you made quite clear there is a toolkit there. You say the data's good, it's consistent, and probably sounds like it might be better than some of the labour market data and other things the ONS is struggling with at the moment, right? But somehow it doesn't feel, does it, as though it's been integrated into government decision making. It doesn't appear in Labour's missions, it doesn't appear in the plan for change, you rarely see it in sort of government documents. Why do you think that's the case? Is it to do with these worries about it being nebulous or, I don't know, fluffy or whatever? And what would it look like if you did sort of really try and integrate measuring wellbeing into policy making?
Yeah. Is this on? Yeah, can you hear me? No. There we go. Try again. Switch.
Oh, it might swap.
Does this one work? Otherwise I'll just project. So I think you're right, that in terms of using it in a practical way, I don't think this is a technical challenge any longer. I've worked in government, I've worked in the social sector, I've used lots of different approaches for looking at the impact of different policies and interventions, and I have to say, very genuinely, using wellbeing is the simplest, easiest, most intuitive, but probably the most insightful option that I've ever used. So as a practical kind of policy maker and person involved in analysing policies, it's a lot easier. So I think for me, this is all about a PR challenge rather than a technical one. And I think that the more we can do to get used to using wellbeing, the better. And I think it's sort of one of those virtuous circle things where more traditional measures of economic output, like GDP, they've got a 70 years head start. They've got, if you ask the average person on the street, they don't actually have any idea what GDP is measuring, but they sort of have an intuitive feel that it's something about whether they'll have a job next year and the level of income they'll have and whether the shops on the high street will still be there, those kinds of things. And I think we sort of need to get to that point of well-being where the average person on the street is never going to know the life satisfaction question off by heart. It took me 7 years. But they will have that sort of intuitive sense that when, hopefully, politicians are standing up in Parliament and talking about well-being, they have this understanding, okay, that's about my quality of life. And when people talk about that going up, that's a good thing. And they're talking about going up quite a lot, which is definitely a good thing. And we need to get to that, and I think that's a sort of virtuous circle of having more journalists, politicians, think tanks, people around policy starting to talk about that, and that will gradually build that familiarity. And once you get to a point where people sort of intuitively know what it means without really knowing all the technical details, at that point, then I think it can become part of that language, part of the tool people are talking about and using on a daily basis.
And in terms of designing policy, you think you've got, it's very clear, Joe's right, the sort of Scottish rental example is a really, really clear one, but you think you've got enough policy for politicians to be able to look and say, okay, looks like if we pull this lever, that might help.
I think we're getting there. I think there is lots of evidence been built over the last 10 years, which gives us insight from that. I'd say there's still more to do. Actually, again, going back to having worked in government as a policy analyst, it's a really useful tool for thinking about these things, and the rental market was a good example of that. That wasn't years and years of work. That was us working with data set over a month or two to kind of pull that together and get that picture. So it's achievable, it's doable, and I think that would make a real difference the more people are applying it. I think the other thing I would flag is that there's lots of great researchers out there, aside from us, that are looking into this and will be coming out with recommendations. I know that Richard and his team have a new paper coming out fairly shortly looking at a number of different policy interventions and assessing which ones are likely to give the biggest bang for our buck in terms of improving well-being. So I think that there's more material coming all the time in terms of what that means for policy.
Interesting. Anyone else have a sense of how different policy might look if we really try to incorporate well-being, in the design of policy or at an earlier stage, or I suppose if we targeted it more, which clearly the government's not particularly doing?
Well, I mean, there's a couple of thoughts I had. So, I mean, one thing I was really excited about this week, the government announced a review of parental leave and pay, which was absolutely overdue and was great. And there's loads of good stuff in it, and of course it's searching for evidence, so the plans aren't defined yet, but I'm kind of hopeful there'll be some good progress. But I looked at the objectives by which the government was going to test the policy, and the 4 objectives they set out were maternal health, childcare access, the best start in life for children, and economic growth. All of which seem laudable, right? But I just also thought, is there not something missing? Right? Maternal health and well-being, that's great, that's really important. But what about dads? I mean, there's been a massive campaign called Dad Shift about, men arguing for better paternity rights, and that is something which is going to be looked at in the review. But are we really saying that that's only important because of their role in supporting childcare and economic growth and supporting the maternal health and well-being? Like, is the rights and the well-being of the men themselves not also an important objective, when a third of the increase in low well-being in the last few years has come from men who are aged between 16 to 45? Like, it just to me seems like, why is it the government can put maternal health and well-being as an objective, but not paternal health and well-being? And it just feels like almost a kind of slightly more transactional kind of, set of thinking about it, and is it that they themselves are sort of like, is that seen as serious, right? And that actually it has to all be about economic growth, rather than saying, as a country, we rely on there being a next generation. As human beings, if we have children, that is a moment in our lives is incredibly significant, has a huge impact on us, and having some time to be able to adapt to that transition and enjoy it is important in and of itself, like beyond what that means for employers and the labour market and so on, and even what it means for the children's health. So anyway, I think there is something kind of missing, and I think even in the missions, I was looking at them for the working groups later. And again, there's a lot of good stuff in the government's missions, but the NHS is part of health, but it isn't all of health. And I think it looks like the plan today is going to have stuff about preventing ill health, which is important. But the goal surely should be the population being healthy and enjoying healthy lives, which might mean policies which are nothing to do with the NHS, but are about active travel or about food that is being created. Safer streets. I mean, that's important, but if you want to have an absence of fear of crime, that also matters in the home when huge amounts of crime, abuse, violence happen within the home. It's not just on the streets. Economic growth. I mean, again, you can have economic growth that is helpful for well-being, and you can have economic growth which is detrimental to well-being. If it's driven by driving down wages and trying to get people to work ever more hours, that's not necessarily good for us as a country. So I think it's still a little bit stuck in this kind of slightly technocratic kind of objectives without an overarching, what is it all for? What are we really aiming at?
But then isn't there something about who has the ear of government? And so if the way in which politics is being influenced or lobbied means that there isn't a kind of clarity on what to do by whichever government happens to be in power, and I think government, the cycles almost feel shorter, obviously not helped by however many prime ministers in however many days across different parties, but I think there is an issue, isn't there, in that we're looking to government to fix this, but they actually don't have the tools or the framework to do so. And actually, a lot of the kind of concepts that relate to well-being will be not just multi-decadal, multi-generational ambitions, they're also intergenerational matters, because, the way in which my well-being manifests will be different to the way in which my parents' generation's well-being might manifest, and so on and so forth. And the generation behind me will feel differently about well-being too, because they're faced with different issues and opportunities. So I wonder as well if there is something about, if not government, then who? And I think we do need to be very interrogative actually about who the government is lobbied by, because there are people, and not to get kind of conspiracy theorist about this, but I think there are people who have an interest in maintaining this status quo because this kind of economic system matters and works for them. And we do have a society that is operating with a very individualistic form of an economy, and the idea of collective well-being is not something that necessarily we want to pursue, because actually if we all kind of understood, if we were less lonely, if we could organise, then the issues that you've described about housing would be entirely different, and private landlords would have a completely different issue on their hands, and it wouldn't be government that was changing them, it would be people and society coming together. And so I wonder if there is something about, is that surely not the role of civil society to help us think generationally, intergenerationally, multi-decadally, some of the work that New Economics Foundation have been doing for decades, in its founding ethos, whether that's a 4-day week, would be an anathema to, business. Yeah, but do you know what I mean? I think we just have to be a bit more honest about this. Maybe it's not government, maybe it's us. And then the other thing is, I do think we need to get into a space of foresight. I think we're very reactive, but actually we know what's happening now, but what's going to happen? You mentioned loneliness. The inputs and the changes that are going to happen in terms of, you know, in this next decade around tech and AI is only going to contribute further to loneliness. Like, we're going to talk to machines rather than to each other. I think the implications it will have on our economy and our workforces, and I know everyone's thinking about AI as ChatGPT, but it's so much more than that. It's robotics too. So, you know, all of these jobs that we think are entry level and safe won't be. And I know I sound like a pea-doomer, because I am, but I think there is an important discussion we need to have when it comes to wellbeing, because at the moment we're so overwhelmed, we're reacting to the issues as they are now and have been for many decades, but the change curve is speeding up, and I think that it won't be government that does that, because it's thinking in political cycles that are getting, I mean, they're 5 years, but they feel shorter than that even, and so it's civil society. We have to step in and take on this work, because we can change policy just through our actions, our activities and the work that we do, and we should be really interrogating who is speaking to government and what are their vested interests, and do they align with ours.
Thank you. Charlie, I want to ask John about the role of GDP and growth in all of this, but did you want to speak up for shadowy lobbyists before we start? Shadowy lobbyists,
I would hope you can do FOIs and find out who's there. So I wasn't saying shadowy.
Transparent lobbyists.
Yeah, I would, you know, first and foremost say that we don't operate in the shadows. We're very much in, you know, public debate and all that kind of stuff. I mean, look, I think, you know, from a business perspective, you know, as I said around kind of the employment rights bill and kind of well-being, we share the ambition to try and create a healthy workforce and ensure that everyone has good jobs. I think it's, you know, it is a challenge at the minute for business in terms of kind of the fiscal landscape. But quite clearly, a healthy workforce is good for the well-being of people, but it is also good for the well-being of businesses. And fundamentally, if we have businesses that are able to benefit from a productive workforce and provide the right conditions for their workers, we will ultimately see kind of benefits to GDP and growth, which will hopefully self-reinforce that point about kind of the broader macroeconomic climate needing to support getting people out of well-being poverty. And I just wanted to quickly touch on, you know, there's been a lot of conversation around kind of you know, the approach that government can take, and potentially sort of the lack of clarity around a framework for this well-being focus. Yeah, quite frankly, I think the government should also be looking at it as a political opportunity. I mean, we've got a large number of parts of this country, you know, kind of looking to the populist narrative, the populist rhetoric of reform. Yeah, quite frankly, as John said, people don't see GDP making a tangible difference to their lives. There was quite a good report produced by the Good Growth Foundation that published some polling showing how, you know, GDP as a metric just doesn't measure with many people in their day-to-day lives. People don't wake up and look at GDP figures in the morning. They look at their bank accounts. Some parts of the policy world, but you know, they look at how much money they have left in their bank account at the end of the month. And if the government can, you know, have an increased focus on well-being and, you know, focus on some metrics that people understand, I would suggest there's also quite a strong political benefit to doing that and challenging the populist narrative.
Joe, what do you think about that? Politicians spent, and this government certainly it's included in this, spent a lot of time looking at polling and focus groups and asking people what they think of this policy and that policy and the other policy. And would it be better, would it be more beneficial ultimately to look beyond that, and instead of saying, would you like it if we did this with policy, or would you like it if we did that with policy, try and find ways of sort of skipping that almost and you know, improving people's lives?
Oh, I mean, I think engaging people is really important. I think, like the focus group, I think the downside of the kind of, I mean, they have their place, but the downside of it is like people go into some, you know, building a meeting room somewhere and they talk for a couple of hours to some market research and they don't hear any more from it. So it's like a kind of like a test of a few people, but they're probably paid for their time, it's very transactional. It's not actually engaging them with agency in the decisions that are being made. I mean, that's qualitatively different to within a local area, there's plans for what's going to happen, and instead of doing the kind of identikit kind of really awful consultation that happens where people don't feel like it is ever going to be taken seriously. Like, you actually get community buy-in and you work with people, and it takes longer, but you get ideas like feeding into what's going to be done in the area. And then it's not like they've been asked their opinion once, it's actually that they've been involved in co-creating it, and that's a very different approach. I was just musing on what Charlie was saying, you know, which is perfectly reasonable, but you know, a good healthy workforce is good for people's lives, and it's also good for business. And we often, you know, make these arguments, you know, and I've done it myself all the time, you know, like, you know, flexible working is good for the economy, gender equality, it's good, you know, it's going to boost growth, etc. And I think, I mean, obviously that's an argument that sometimes works, but when you said that in the context of Safina's comments about AI, I just thought, what if a healthy workforce stops being necessary for business? Like, and if that's like almost part of our motivation for thinking business should care about it, right? Like, and it's not impossible with AI that we could get there. And so I think what I take from that is really that there's more of a need now to make the argument for something being good in and of itself, not only for the impact that it has on some other goal or mission. Like, it's good because it's going to be good for economic growth. Well, actually, no, if it makes people's lives better, it's good. And actually, even if you're a business, that's something which matters because you're a stakeholder within society. So I'm not being critical. It was more just a kind of a thought that came to mind that, like, do we need to be bolder about how we make that case, rather than the sort of more transactional case, which is the easier one to make because you're going with the grain of what people are already having in their set of objectives. But is there a need for a reframe about what's actually important that we might be missing with our current objectives?
So John, I want to ask you, are we talking here about downgrading growth, making GDP a less important measure? There's definitely, so in the run up to the spending review, because growth is such a sort of central target of this government, you know, departments were sort of scrambling around desperately trying to show that anything that they were going to do was pro-growth, sort of put a sort of growth badge on it, and it was more likely to meet with approval. Should we be, is the balance a bit wrong there? Where does wellbeing fit in?
So I think the balance definitely is wrong, in my view. But I think we need to think about, well, what roles does GDP play at the moment? And some of those I think it's very important for and will remain important for. And the way I sort of describe it is, actually GDP is very good for understanding the potential tax base. And that matters to governments because they need to be able to afford whatever plans they're putting in place. And it matters to the markets when they're judging on whether the government's going to be able to pay it back. So I don't think we're ever going to get rid of GDP, but we need to be clear what purpose it's serving. People also use it as a shorthand for quality of life. And I think that's where there's a problem. That's where something like Wellbeing does a much better job. So I think it's about shifting what's the discussion we're having, and therefore is GDP the right metric, or is it something else like Wellbeing? And we would argue that Wellbeing is a pretty simple, intuitive way of understanding that quality of life question. And if I can take it away from Joe's very sort of worthy points and go really shallow again for a moment, there's also really good evidence that Wellbeing is a very good predictor of voting behaviour.
Yeah, that's what I was, when I was talking about jumping beyond the focus groups, that was the point I was very inarticulately trying to make. Would it actually be better, rather than saying, do you have this policy and that policy, to try and find the policies that will improve people's lives, which might make them feel more favourable towards the government?
So there's a couple of bits of evidence that I think are relevant here. The first one is it is a good predictor of voting behaviour, and it's a stronger predictor than the economy. So actually, if you're thinking about what matters, then they really should be thinking, or even on a very shallow level, worrying about well-being matters. Also, I saw some polling data recently that looked at levels of well-being and voter preference for which parties. And the strongest groups for voting reform were people with lower well-being, unsurprisingly. So, you know, these are the disenfranchised people that want change and are looking elsewhere. Actually, we've got evidence of that. So you put those two things together, and yes, the government really should be caring about well-being, even on the shallowest level for its own survival.
Let's take some questions. I think we've got quite an informed audience, so I've been told. Set the bar high. Anyone? A lady there? Oh, there's two. There's a lady and a gentleman almost right next to each other there. How convenient. Let's do those two.
Can you go first?
And if you could say, you know, who you are and where you're from.
Hello, Eddie Tolasevich. I'm an independent researcher. Two things. First, is there? What about age? How does well-being vary with age. You know, the population's getting older, blah, 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 wondering what the figures on that might be. And the second sort of reflection is, I mean, we are slightly still a Puritan society, and the notion of well-being, happiness, quality of life may rub it up against that. So it is about how do we brand this. I think that's really important. You know, that's obviously sort of the surface, and below it will remain the data. But what we call this is important. You know, better lives I quite like. You know, this is all about making people have better lives, happier lives. You know, do people think it's right that people should be happy? You know, perhaps we should all be miserable. I don't know. There's something sort of societal about this that might sort of hinder it getting the traction that it needs. That's just a personal observation on that.
Very interesting. Yeah, lady next to you.
Donna Alden from the Department for Work and Pension. Kind of question and some reflection also from the panel. When you presented the data around the well-being, you didn't cover much around the demographics, so not only age, but also understanding more about the demographic and the kind of life of these people would be interesting. I'm kind of making an association between when I look at the inactivity data. So we have 10 million inactive people of working age in the country. And one reason of increasing inactivity is ill health, both general health and mental health. And I wonder if there is an investigation in kind of a correlation and causation of not being in work, not having and well-being poverty, which is kind of challenge the connection that the just exposition of between is all GDP growth or is all just well-being, because there is a lot of research, thanks also to the work that Richard has done around the importance of good work on well-being, impact on mental health impact, and at the end of the day, what can give us good work is economic growth. And this economic growth is important to give good jobs to the people or to give to the government the means to support people who cannot work.
Okay, excellent. John, did you want to answer that one first?
Yep.
On the demographics part from
So we've got a bit more of that in the report, so go and take a look. I can't remember the figure number, but there's somewhere in there a chart showing it, levels of wellbeing and poverty broken down by a host of different demographics. On the age point, you tend to see with wellbeing a bit of a U-shaped curve, so people's wellbeing for adults tends to be higher in their 20s and 30s, then dip, and then get better again towards older age, essentially after retirement most of the time. In terms of those changes that we've seen since before the pandemic, we saw biggest increases in wellbeing poverty amongst younger age groups, both men and women. So there was a big shift there, and that potentially fits in with some of what you're talking about, inactivity, potentially around poor mental health and inactivity. There is definitely an overlap there, and there's a sort of sweet spot between GDP and tackling wellbeing around health and inactivity. I think where doing something in that area will tick both boxes. So I completely agree with that. On the description of this, what we describe it as, that is an ongoing challenge. Like, do you call it well-being? Do you call it happiness? Happiness, frankly, gets picked up in the press more, which is why I think a lot of people use it. I personally don't like it. I think it feels a little bit temporary, ephemeral, and too nice. Doesn't feel like quite fundamental enough. So I prefer well-being. That feels more rooted in what matters to people. I'm sure there's lots of other phrases. It's really hard to sort of all decide on what's the right thing. But I think there is an important role for journalists to play in deciding what language gets picked up and used around this.
Anyone else have thoughts either on the demographics of it or on the sort of branding points?
Yeah, I mean, I think on the branding, I remember when we were naming the old party group, definitely happiness felt too fluffy, but well-being on its own also felt a little bit yoga. So we went for wellbeing economics, so it was like, economics is very serious, and, science behind it, which there is, and well-being, which kind of says something. quality of life would be, you know, and I think, in a sense, I think it's probably not a problem that different people will use different terminology in slightly different circumstances. And if the sensationalist like headline that actually gets it read in a newspaper is happiness, that's also kind of fine. And so I think, you know, and again from this wider thing, you know, you have like this donor economics, and there's well-being, and there's regenerative, and there's like the different words actually have helpful functions for kind of broadening the net of people that might be engaged with the thinking. So as long as it's not overly exclusive, I think let many flowers bloom on language.
Okay. Any other thoughts on that? Or shall we throw it? I think we've just about probably got time to take a couple more. There's a lady there, glasses, and why don't we just take the gentleman next to you also, who coincidentally put his hand up.
Katie Ghosh from Kids, Visible Disabled Children, Young People and their families. So my question is, how do we bring children and young people into this fascinating discussion, because they are going to be the people who will be in that chart of wellbeing and poverty pretty soon, unfortunately. And just to illustrate that, if you look at our very exam-focused education system that hasn't been thinking about the quality of life and stuff that matters to young people, like how many friends have I got, that's beginning to shift. There's some levers and opportunities, curriculum and assessment review. Ofsted, some of us are kind of trying to influence that agenda. And I don't know if anyone is here from the government's foresight team, they're about to do something on the future of childhood. So I just think, how can we make these links here and get some really good quality data and insights? The final reflection is simply that I spend a lot of time with my teenage daughter and how others, there's a real mental health literacy that the younger generation have got around this stuff that could really inform all of us adults.
Interesting. And gentleman next to you, just to be very efficient, and we'd better take one from Richard as well, I think. So you go first.
Yeah, I will be quick. So hi, I'm Jonathan, and I run a charity doing cash transfers to people experiencing homelessness. And the question is about what areas of spend do we think are going to be effective at affecting well-being. So for example, in homelessness, would say, you know, temporary accommodation costs a lot of money and probably gets us pretty rubbish outcomes on well-being. So how do you spend better, and what general policy areas are going to be effective at doing that?
Very interesting and very concise. Thank you. And if you could have the mic at the front as well.
I wanted to support strongly what John said a few minutes back. At the technical level, we've made enormous progress. It's at the PR level that we haven't. At the technical level, the Treasury Green Book now says that well-being is the objective of public expenditure, and these are the calculations that people are meant to have been making in this spending review. They're not very well equipped to do it, but it will be much better in the next spending review, and that's a very, very good development. We suffer from the fiscal rules because the test to pass the well-being criterion called current expenditure is much tougher than if it's called capital expenditure, and this reflects an extraordinary degree of materialism in the way the fiscal rules are written. So that's a sort of small battle to be fought, but the big battle to be fought is on the whole issue of how do we get well-being at the centre of all the debate about all major public issues. And we collectively have extraordinarily failed to do this. I think that the idea of requiring a national wellbeing report annually from the Prime Minister, if that's at all a good thing to argue for, it would be wonderful if such a thing happened. But I would love to hear from the panel, you know, what are the great ideas for how we can get ourselves into the debate?
Gosh, it's quite a lot there, and we're running quite short of time. But anyone like to take the point about children and how we bring them in?
I'd have a crack at the sort of, particularly like looking at young people. So, you know, again, from a business perspective, you know, we've seen the kind of modern industrial strategy published last month. That obviously has, you know, a big focus on the UK's 8 growth sectors, and there's a lot of support for those sectors. But clearly around the kind of topic of, you know, good jobs and making sure that sort of young people have those opportunities. Clearly the foundational sector, whether that be retail or hospitality as examples, will also play quite an important role in terms of giving young people the experiences in terms of the workplace, but also if we are talking about a world where people are sitting in front of screens more often on social media, some of those softer skills needed to kind of succeed within their careers. And again, I've touched upon it around some of the challenges that businesses are facing at the minute. It is those kind of foundational sectors that are being particularly hit hard in terms of some of the policy directions. So again, the more we can do to kind of focus on those foundational sectors, I think will have a positive impact in terms of transitioning people into good jobs.
John, you was coming on.
Just on the children front. So you're absolutely right. We focused on the adults here because we tend to get different data for adults compared to children, and there tend to be different drivers of wellbeing for adults versus children. So this is very much a sort of adult-focused report. We have done a separate report on children's wellbeing that was published last year, and the one thing I would flag that sort of led out of that is a campaign we're working on with Be Well and others, and got some folks from Be Well here, around getting a national children's wellbeing framework in place to measure children's wellbeing on a regular basis, because we would love to give it the same sort of weight that we get through academic results from the National Pupil Database. Let's look at wellbeing as well to understand the impact that the interventions are having on that. So that's something we've got some very live work on. It wasn't the focus of this report, but I can agree with you.
Funnily enough, I feel like the idea of happiness, I feel like probably the public would like our kids to be happy, right? Even if we, I feel like that you can quite easily use that. Are our kids miserable? I think it's a pretty, pretty good policy question, even if we don't feel quite the same about the adult. Can I just ask you quickly about that homelessness question, types of spending, and what, do we have any evidence on what works?
Richard and his team will be coming out with some evidence around this. I mean, I think that the usual one that comes out is a lot of further investment in mental health is like to make a difference, not just because it improves well-being, but also because there's potential savings to the rest of the health system from it. So if you improve somebody's mental health, they're likely to cost less in terms of physical health support. I think homelessness is a really interesting one because that's a group that tends to get missed from the data. They get missed from all sorts of data, but particularly around well-being, it's a bit of a gap in terms of they tend to get missed from all the surveys, but undoubtedly a group that's struggling with their well-being. I think that'd be pretty confident saying that. So I think that's an area for more work if we want to justify it through a well-being lens.
Brilliant. We're kind of over our time. Does anyone have any brief thoughts on what we call it, how we get it into the Safina?
I do think framing matters. I think wellbeing is actually an interesting one because I don't think it is as susceptible to being considered a progressive cause or like the culture wars or you're too woke if you care about well-being. So I think there is an opportunity, and to your kind of puritanical point, like who can really argue whether you're religious or not, or against a good life, a decent society and a livable planet, and you don't have to be anywhere on the political spectrum or a specific place on the political spectrum to care about those things. So I think in ways that other things can feel too progressive, well-being has a kind of broad mass appeal, but as you say, maybe not through happiness, maybe not through the term well-being because perhaps that's a bit jargonistic, but if you kind of break it down into its like what that means for people as in individuals, what does that mean for society, what does that mean for our planet, then I think maybe there is some kind of way of socialising it and mainstreaming it so that it makes sense wherever you are and whatever your political leanings are. And I do think in all of these things, until we get to root causes and think systemically, then we will keep having to, spend this on that to fix this, but until we tackle the fact that there aren't enough homes, there aren't enough ways in which people get the kind of mental and physical health support that they need. We've got a loneliness crisis for these reasons. Like, we're just going to keep throwing money at the problem, but we need to kind of zoom out and get systemic, I think, and tackle those root causes of any of these issues. But, that's an obvious point to make.
An obvious point, but a good one. Do you just want to come in?
Ever so quickly on children, I think that one of the really interesting pieces of research in the last year or so is the Jonathan Haidt stuff on the anxious generation and the impact of smartphones as a parent. I know it's very live. And I wonder actually how much that is something which is impacting on all of our health when you look at those graphs of mental health and loneliness and so on. And it might be an interesting subject for kind of future study, but that's a good example of where it's kind of not just one policy, but it's looking at what are the other things which are impacting. And so it might look like tech companies doing really well is like good for the economy because GDP is growing, but actually if it's making us all more miserable and putting more stress on, then it's ultimately not. So that holistic picture is really important.
Okay, thank you very much. I think I know I'm conscious I'm keeping everyone from their coffee, so we should go next door for refreshments, and if you could reconvene at 11 for the roundtable discussions about how wellbeing can be applied in practice to the government's 5 missions. And maybe we can all discuss how we rebrand happiness, well-being, whatever you want to call it, over coffee. Maybe we'll come up with the answer by the time we get back. So first, we could just thank the panel in the usual.